Welcome back to Running the Show, a podcast exploring the intersection of running and business. Last week, we were able to meet with Laura Thweatt and break down that first episode of Netflix Sprint. And we've anticipated this series for a long time. We're so happy it's here. And that's why we're spending this week by week and episode by episode companion style series. We want to not take this series for granted. We want to break down what we see for the athletes, for the sport, for just generally from a production value, what we can expect. And we're excited to bring you our second episode companion today. Please enjoy. And we're back. Episode 1, done. Episode 2, on the way.
Yep.
Super exciting.
We are pumped for episode 2. I could not wait to jump in when I saw the title. I was like, Queens, let's go. And it did not disappoint. I'm so here for this. That's the rivalries that they're building. And it's funny because I'm watching it, and obviously I know how the World Championships played out. Mm-hmm. But it's like I have forgotten because I'm so into like the now of what's going on and like where they are and how they're staging it. So it's great. I get to like relive that. I'm like, man, what did happen? What's going to happen? Who do I root for? I don't know.
It's true. I found myself like in looking at all these episodes and trying to engage with it on a longer form way of like looking at these different phases of each episode and seeing like if there's some way to conceptualize a little bit easier that way. So similar to last time, there's like the introduction, right? Like the sizzle reel that kind of takes place before they get into these more like longer.
Yeah, they can like build it up a little bit of like, this is what it's going to be.
Right. And as you said, Laura, right? Episode 2 is Queens. It's about like the women of the 100, but not every woman in the 100, right?
Like 2.
Yeah.
Just 2.
Yeah.
So that, at least that's how I felt. It was like between Sha'Carri Richardson and Shericka Jackson and like really building that out. And like with building that out, they're obviously building out the rivalry between Jamaica and the United States. And then they're bringing in like Allison Felix and Otto Bolton and, you know, Usain Bolt and kind of, you know, Michael Johnson and all those guys to talk about that rivalry that has really been growing, you know, since the 90s, especially on the women's side. I felt like they really, really painted it on the women's side, how that was like really big and has been big. And maybe because I feel like when they were doing the men, they didn't really touch on that as much. And then this one, like hot out of the gates, it's like they set it up as like, this is it, right? Like this is kind of the rivalry we're going to focus on and talk about the history of that. But I was kind of expecting them to bring more people in. And I'm only 2 in. I think there's like 4 more to go. So I don't know how that will play out. But yeah, they really just painted it between those 2. And that's what they focused on. I thought was interesting.
In that introduction side, right, to your exact point, they lead with the primary of Sha'Carri, right? And like the thing they paint this huge personality, but they almost like, I don't want to say they paint her to like fail in a way, but they bring up this juxtaposition more so than they did with Noah Lyles. Noah Lyles is the big personality. He's like the magician. He always, you know, dominates. But they kind of, I don't know, if I were to be critical, and maybe this is like the whole point with Noah, they talk about how his persona is what makes him so great. And when I looked at this like sizzle reel in the beginning, right, they're talking about, you know, Sha'Carri's eating chips before the filming starts, and they do that for a reason.
Yeah,
right. And it's like they paint this picture of like we're just living in Sha'Carri's world, and they show that she ran 10.57, which is like crazy, and then immediately they're like, oh, she had a terrible 2022 season. People think she's overhyped. They set her up almost as like adversarial to the media as well, right?
Yes, because they showed that clip of her being fiery, like air quotes there, with the media when she was just calling them out and being like, yo, like, we're human. Like, yes, we're athletes and we're here to perform and put on a show and show you how hard we've been working and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, we're going to we're going to fail sometimes. We're going to like miss it. We're not always going to like get out. We're not perfect. And she was like, we're human. And like the way you portray us in the media is like really unfair. And I thought that was so interesting, Drew, because they did not do that at all with the men. And like they're painting her to kind of be, like you said, like it was kind of frustrating to watch that, because you're just like, okay, so you have a really strong personality in this incredible, like independent, like fierce, badass woman, and you're almost trying to like paint it as like it's bad, or it's like, you know, there's conflict with that. And like I think that's always been such an issue on women's side of things, is it's like you have these confident women who believe in who they are and who know how good they are and know what they're capable of, but every time they hype themselves up and they talk that way, like she does the exact same thing that Noah Lyles does, but it's like we almost make it out as like, oh, she's arrogant, or she's overhyped, or, you know, she's coming off fiery with the media and she has all this stuff to say. And it's just like, I feel like that's such a narrative in sports, and it's like so frustrating. And so like when I like rewatched the episode, I kind of started seeing it through that lens, and I was like, wait, this is being painted so differently than how they did the men like an episode before. Like, great point.
Yeah. Well, I do want to get into like, as we go into these different phases of like the focus on the US training, the focus on the Jamaican training, I do want to point out some comparisons to the episode 1 where they're looking at, you know, like Noah and that storyline in episode 1 for sure. When we talk about, right, this idea of like painting these narratives in women's sports that are different, this is a really short-lived like other podcast, like one that I've enjoyed listening to, Meghan Markle's Archetypes podcast, if you had the chance to listen to it.
Okay, I haven't listened to it, but I just feel like I need to.
I think she did 6 episodes, and like she got a ton of money from Spotify for it, which is dope. But I think the first episode, like the whole concept of archetypes, Meghan Markle explores what kind of labels and archetypes are placed on women, and then provides examples by bringing in people who maybe like challenge those things. And one of them was on like divas, for example, in this history of like what a diva is. And then she brings on Mariah Carey to talk about it. But in sport, she brings on one of the Williams sisters to talk about what like aggression in sport, how it's gendered differently, if you will, right? In those different experiences, and what's permissible is like as a woman in sport and what's permissible as a man in sport. So that just crosses my mind for sure. It kind of shapes my perspective in seeing this. But something I want to ask you if you can go further on before we even move forward, right? You mentioned the specific media interaction where she's like, we're human, we're athletes, we're on display, but we are people. I know you said that resonated with you. Is there like anything that you can point to, like in your experience, where you're like, oh man, maybe there's like a headline or like an IG post or something, maybe about like something that you were involved in, or just some things that you've seen that have just like sat wrong with you in the commentary?
Yeah, I think like the most recent one that I'm thinking of, it happened this year. It wasn't with me. Like, I feel like I've never had anything directed at me of being like, oh, like she missed here. Like, I put that own expectation on myself. But I watched the LA Grand Prix earlier this year, and it was the women's 200 where Sid came out and just like crushed this incredible 200 meter women's field, some of the best 200 meter runners in the world, and Sid like walks away with the title. And I think Gabby Thomas was like 5th. She got destroyed on social media. People were tweeting all of this stuff about how she doesn't look good, and like essentially kind of the same thing, like she's overhyped, she's not showing up, like there's no excuse for her to come out here and get 5th, like how embarrassing that like Sydney McLaughlin beat her, like all of this stuff, just being like she's not in good form, like there's no way she's gonna make this team, like all this stuff. And I'm going through some of these tweets, and I'm like, holy shit. And like I had the same thought as Sha'Carri. I'm like, we're freaking human. Like we're not perfect. We're not these machines that just like always show up. And like one of the tweets was something to the effect of like, as paid professional athletes, there's no room for error. And there's no room like for you to come out and not perform at like the level that you should be performing at. So it's just like, it also like, so yeah, it was just one of those where you're like, we're human and we're just like anyone else. And you're like, you're going to have bad games. You're going to have bad races. Like you're going to have things that interfere with what you're able to do on the track. And also in an Olympic year, the goal is the Olympics for someone like Gabby Thomas. Like she wants to be peaking in August, not in May. So of course she shouldn't be in like incredible form. And sometimes you have athletes like Sid who just, you know, always do kind of seem to be on and just have this incredible talent level. And so again, it's like every athlete is different with how they approach this year and like what they're peaking for and like what that's going to look like. And so she was great. Gabby Thomas was great. And she just like put something out and she was like, I'm not worried. Like, yeah, today wasn't great, but like it's all part of the plan. And then she steps out there, you know, a couple weeks later and like crushes the 200 going into the trials. And she's like, I told you, like, I'm good to go. But it's like the same thing. It's just like, I feel like sometimes when you're at that level of like global superstardom, no matter what sport you're in, it's like people don't view you as being human. Like they view you as this machine and like they obviously want to watch you perform and they want to watch like greatness. And like, it just is funny to me how sometimes like everything else gets overlooked and like that's just the expectation. And if you don't meet their expectation, then it's like, well, what's wrong with you? Like, oh, you're overhyped. So that was something that I was thinking about earlier because I was like, man, like it's wild. So I loved that she was like, knock it off, like have a little grace, right? But again, like I love that they showed that clip and like called it fiery. When you're just like, she's just calling it like it is. And like if Noah Lyles did the same thing, like would we be talking about it? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if Noah Lyles was dismissive of people and said like, I'm just here to race or whatever, like that would be perceived, I think, differently from a media perspective and on social. I mean, something that you just brought up that I think is lost on many people, especially folks who are like maybe not as well versed in track events or an event that involves multiple competitions in the scope of like a larger goal, is right. Like, yeah, sure. Like somebody might do 2 marathons a year, 1 marathon a year or something like that if they're in running, or they might do a few 5Ks or something like that. But Gabby Thomas is racing probably how many 200s on the way in, like over the course of a full year or 2 years, because these athletes are thinking in 4-year cycles. Yeah, it's great to like go get the prize money and stay sharp. But to your exact point, there's the larger goal for many, if not all of these athletes, is performing at the pinnacle event in order to, you know, challenge themselves, impress their sponsors, grow their own personal brand. All of those things are more calculated than I think people may consider. And even relating back to like episode 1 with the commentary on Marcel Jacobs not racing often, that is a calculated decision as well. These other races that maybe Marcel decided not to race, is they weren't, you know, going to help the greater goal potentially. So yeah, it's just an interesting way for them to like start this and kind of put people against each other and kind of go from there. But you also mentioned, right, they're introducing this U.S. versus Jamaica conflict right off the bat, and they do so through the lens of mainly Shelly-Ann Fraser-Pryce, right, and kind of establishing who just dominated the space for so long. A little bit of Elaine Thompson-Herah, like, right?
Yeah,
a little bit.
Like we had like a skosh of her in there, and then I was like, wow, like that's, yeah, I was just surprised that there wasn't more on both of them.
Right. And then, right, they build up Shericka Jackson as the person, like the new kid, to go from there.
Well, I love when they asked her, they were like, they've basically like crowned you as like the future of Jamaican sprinting. Like, how do you feel about that? And she was like, yeah, I'm not going to answer that.
Yeah.
She was like, no, I'm not going to go there. So again, I thought that was interesting because again, I mean, like when you look at Jamaican sprinting and you look at like the powerhouses that have essentially like built it into what it is, especially on the women's side, like what a question. So I don't know. I mean, you can only speculate why she didn't want to answer that, but I was just like, I'm sure she's like respect to like, you know, just the history of the sport and these women that have essentially like paved the way for her to continue the legacy. But yeah, I thought that was funny. She's like, nah, I'm not going to answer that.
She's so young too, right? Like
so young. Yeah. And that's such a big crown or weight. Like, I think her coach said that like she's essentially, someone said that, I can't remember who, but someone was saying that she's essentially carrying the weight of like Jamaica on her shoulders because, what was it? I think it was Usain Bolt that said it's not track and field or athletics. Sprinting is the national sport of Jamaica. And so when you are kind of this up and coming new sprinter and she went out and won like the Jamaican championships, and that's a huge deal in the women's 100. That's kind of like the crown that you're ultimately given. And then there's all this pressure and expectation that come with that. And she's so young and everyone has such high hopes as you kind of see this next generation coming up. But yeah, I mean, that's a lot to carry. So,
yeah. Well, I know when they get into this phase, like this first phase, and they're focusing on like the U.S. training camp, right? Star Athletics Club is introduced and they're showing a few big names that kind of go under the radar, like Kofi Kenny's. And
they just like, sprinkle me and you're like, oh my God, like there's so many people here.
Star-studded training environment, right? This kind of like iron sharpens iron. Everyone's kind of like shit talking each other, like actively, but also cheering each other on. So it's this weird, not weird, but it is, it's a high energy environment. And they introduce, unlike the previous episode with Noah, they introduced Noah's coach, but like he doesn't really have any significance. Whereas like in this episode, they're like Dennis Mitchell, the guy, and they introduce Dennis and they talk about how, you know, he was involved in his recollection, which is kind of funny because it fits his personality very well. When Dennis Mitchell is like, you know, there was a golden era of this sport that I happen to be in. Right. Like he
was like when he was talking about the 92 Olympics when they won gold and set like the world record in the 4x1. And he was like, we were celebrities. Like we were like the top of the game. Like, you know, like we were famous basically. Like that was the era of like US sprinting, like back in the 90s. I love when he was like, we were celebrities.
Yeah.
Everyone wanted to be us.
Yeah. And it helps paint this picture of, you know, how he approaches the sport as well. And he's like, we've been in a drought. And I think he said, right, like the US fell off and he's trying to restore that personally. And he said, I finally have a team that can do it.
Yeah, he basically said, like, I haven't had the athletes to do it with. And now I feel like that's the tide is turning. But I thought that was also interesting. He was basically like, yeah, I just haven't had the talent, couldn't do anything with it. You're like, damn. Okay. Brutal.
The theme of this whole, like, of this episode to me, obviously, like, when you're talking about rivals, you're comparing two different programs, and that involves different athletes and different coaches inherently. But like this is a story of differences where they show, right, the training facility and the people, the big personalities in the U.S. for like the if you know you know crowd, but then they cut to Jamaica, to Kingston, and the reality of the training environment is there. Like they're showing people at like a street market and goats on the road, and like I guess like my stress to everyone watching every element of this, from like Sha'Carri eating chips in like the opening scenes to like them filming like goats in the road, is like everything is there for a reason, right? And like the producers were like, that's going to make the cut.
Well, and they showed the introduction to Sharika Jackson was her driving by a street market and ordering 2 plantains.
Yes.
Like, that's how they introduce her.
Right.
And then you look at how they introduce Sha'Carri. Like, I don't know. Like, it was the same. I was just like, wow, we are really painting this out.
Yeah.
We're setting up.
The track facility, like the track itself looked good, but then like the buildings that were around it were like not as polished as you would see in the US. And they're there's the comparison of that. There's the comparison of the two athletes where she carries the big personality. Look at me. I want to be the best at everything because I want to be in the front. And then the personality of Sherika Jackson, who's like openly being complimented when she's ordering food. And she's like, no, don't look at me. Like, I'm just here.
Yeah. And then like, and also her like refusing to answer that question where she was, I don't want to be asked that, like, next. So different. So different.
The coaches too, from like a personality perspective, you see these parallels where like, it's almost like a chicken and the egg kind of thing, right? Where you see Dennis Mitchell being like, I was the cream of the crop back in the day. I was a world record holder. I was in the golden era of like sprinting for the US. And Sha'Carri kind of puffs the chest out in the same way, the way that she walks through the world. And the coach for Jamaica, right? Like he was so much, humble. It brings my own thoughts into this too much, but like Paul Francis, the coach of Jamaica, is kind of like, he talks about obligation of the program doing well. He talks about like the weight of the challenge, like you mentioned, Laura. Whereas Dennis Mitchell is like, we're gonna restore it's just two very different energies.
Such different energies and such different approaches, and two very different athletes. So again, it's just interesting. Like now we're seeing how they're really going to build this and like the direction that this is going to go and what they're trying to paint for people. It's just like it's just opposite in every way. Yeah.
The one thing that felt a little bit, let's say, like, I know they went to like the US first, then to Jamaica, then they kind of come back to the US for like some of those gym scenes, and Sha'Carri's talking about how she loves shit talking, and like apparently so does Dennis Mitchell, right? Like it kind of like puts in that note to be like, this is something you should expect, and kind of introduces that loud personality of like some of the favorite athletes in global sport period are the ones who like know they're good. They're going to tell you they're better, and they either get silenced in the moment or like they point into the fence and hit the home run like Babe Ruth, like that kind of stuff. But something I felt like a little more on the reserved side for Sha'Carri, even though she's talking about like shit talking, it's an outlet for the energy. It's what makes me great. It lets me do what I need to do. She does acknowledge the challenge of sprinting against Jamaica. Like it's almost like I didn't expect that, given how they were setting this up of like, she's the world beater. She's going to talk shit to everybody. That's a whole different side that I didn't expect.
Yeah, no, I thought that was cool that she like acknowledged and gave respect to what I think you have to give respect to, regardless of who you are. Like in that event, you have to look at the history of it, and you have to look at some of these women who have dominated and really opened up the floodgates for what's possible. And so for her, it's like, yeah, like Shelly Ann Fraser-Price, like, some of those women, like they're not American women, but it's like they set the tone for the 100, and like they've been so dominant, and they've really like, again, showed what can be possible in that event. And so it's like, you have to pay respect to that, like regardless of what side of the fence you're on or what country you're competing for. So I thought it was cool that like in her own way, she like acknowledged that. And like, even like Allison Felix, like same thing. She was just like, this rivalry goes like way back, like in the sprints, like you have to like, Jamaica is who you want to be. And then like Usain Bolt said the same thing. He was just like, you want to win against the USA, like, but you have to acknowledge that history and kind of which athletes have paved that road, and like respect that. And so I feel like it was cool to see her be like, yeah, like I'm aware, like I know that this is what I'm after, and this is the goal, is to, because she was like, Jamaican women always bring it, like when you're going to compete against them, that they're going to show up with their A game, and so you're like, yeah, I mean that's what makes this like head to head and like, the Olympics and like world championships so fun to watch when you have really great athletes from both sides, because, you're like, it could go either way. So that was, yeah, again, just speaking to that, I thought was cool.
Yeah. And I know when they actually set up and we get to like the Poland Diamond League competition, right, to go into all of this, there's a few things I want to dig into and some things I want to like kind of toss your way, Laura, to provide perspective. But something to think about in the way they frame this. Obviously, they're doing like the commentary of explaining the race, like post edit, right? So someone's just like doing a voiceover, and they describe this as the last opportunity for Sha'Carri and Shericka Jackson to face off before the World Championship, and that's something that like maybe was not known at the time. You take like given where this fell in the year, but it's interesting to think of like, all right, this is why this is like the vignette they're focusing on this early on, because they ended up not racing against each other for the rest of the Diamond League,
Well,
which might not have been known to everybody.
I didn't know that. Like that was good for me to know because again, I don't follow the Diamond League as closely as I probably should. And so it was good insight for me to have because I didn't realize that. And that's such a pinnacle, like that's such a pivotal thing because it's just like they were saying, like this is kind of the last head-to-head matchup before the World Championships. And like you want to win this one because you want that confidence and you want to, you know, take up that rent-free space in your competitor's head essentially. And so like this was like pivotal for that. But I didn't realize that either. And so I'm glad that they kind of explained that and then like focused in on this one and like why this one was so important for both of these athletes that they're featuring.
Yeah. And it comes back to the point that you made. It's all juxtaposed to like where people are at in their season.
Yep.
This, yes, like you were saying, this is the shot across the bow for you to like put your flag in the ground and say like, look, I'm here, I'm better. But it might not correlate with when like you want to peak in the year and things like that. So again, helpful to have the framework provided, but like unpacking that a little bit and understanding where that falls in the calendar year, you'd be like, oh yeah, I get like that's not the
because athletes approach it differently, you know, and it's just like that head to head might be like really important for one athlete's confidence going into like the next big thing, but like for another they're like, well, that's not the goal and this is just like a stepping stone to like what I'm really training for, and so we'll just see how it goes. Like that's the thing, you just never know where people are at when like there's this big thing on the horizon that everyone is slowly trying to get like ready for. Like everyone approaches that so differently. So it's like you can't, not every athlete's going to show up and just crush everything en route to that. Some do, but like that's not the case for everyone. So you know, it's important to like recognize and like remember that because I think that gets lost and it's just like, oh, well, you lost. So like you're obviously like not going to make an Olympic team. And you're like, what? Like we had like 5 months. Like, what's going on?
To your point, something that I might have missed in the way they put this out there, but I know, right, Paul Francis, the coach for Jamaica, he discusses how like this is the US's chance to like shock the world, right? To like stake their claim against Jamaica, and says like this is what everyone, all eyes in the world are on this particular matchup to dictate who will win Worlds. And Otto talks about how like Sha'Carri's never looked better coming into a meet, but if she doesn't win, it casts so much doubt in her ability to like compete in the world landscape. The thing that I truly forget, and like please correct me, I don't know if were those voiceovers or were those like live?
I think these were voiceovers.
Okay.
Because I feel like they were showing clips of Sha'Carri running and then Otto or someone was saying that.
Yeah. I would bring that up because like it just, I love to, in these moments and in these ways, right? The energy is so high, the narrative is so deep, and it has so much momentum to have that ability to like pull back out in real life and be like, all right, this is probably something they lended some more context to. And maybe this is like, this is over-explained for the sake of the argument, because it would almost feel weird. Right? Like if in the moment the coach of Jamaica was like, this is the U.S. chance to shock the world. And if they do, like that's going to determine who's going to win the, like, I don't know if like many coaches would like in the moment be able to or want to put that much emphasis on like the bigger picture.
Yeah, well, that also makes me think like context. It's like, was that just like taken out and like they liked that line? Like, because yeah, like I can't imagine. I feel like there's more to that. And I can't remember how they did that now that I'm thinking about it. I like need to go back and like rewatch that because that is an interesting point where you're like, huh, Okay, interesting statement from Paul Francis. Like, I feel like there was like more around that probably, or like more questions being asked, which led him to like essentially tie it up with that. And they were like, we'll just use this. You're like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. I want more.
And I know that they set things up that way, like the tension's getting high, or they talk about like the psychological warfare side of things going into it, which is a little bit more of like, they got into that more than they did in the 100 for the men in episode 1, about like what people might do to throw each other off, and how you have this shot of them like going next to each other in the practice area to do starts, which like that's a lot of like,
so intense. I was like, good Lord, I'd probably go right there.
yeah. There's like a lot of peacocking, but I guess the thing that kind of volley your way, Laura, is like, obviously all events are different and they're dependent on like the personalities in the room to make them. But can you take us into like a backstage moment in racing, like before you go out, if you're in like the holding area, what is that like? Whether it's an elite tent and a marathon, or if it's something like more track trials oriented, or, you know, a big meet, how do you describe that?
I mean, like thinking back to the Olympic trials in 2016, I was being in the 10K, and I don't know, I feel like the track environment is just like so much more intense. Because you're all like 20 minutes before the race, like there's different like holdings that they put you in. So you're just in this like tented, you start in like the check-in room, which is like this tented like tent in like the warm-up area. And you're all checking in and you're changing your shoes, and like, you know, like you're kind of all around each other, but you still have some like space to kind of like do some strides, run around, like you're all kind of staying around this area. And then they take you from that area and they take you underneath the track. So this was in Eugene, underneath the stadium for like the final call room. And you're all just in there, and it's like this tiny, like there's like a little bit of a warm-up track you can do strides on, but it's like this tiny little area, and you're all like, all 25 of you are just sitting in there, like, you know, putting your numbers on, you have your spikes on, like there's just so much nervous energy. And I feel like that really is true. I think it was in the first episode, Noah was saying like you can walk into a room and like really kind of like feel that energy and almost know who is where with like how they're feeling. And like that is so true. I think it's a little bit different in like distance events, because you don't have quite as much of that like peacocking and like outwardly just kind of like, I'm gonna fuck you up. Because again, it's like, well, you only have like in the 100, it's like these guys and girls are out there for like 9 to 10 seconds, and it's like such a short like everything has like, it's such a short time that you're really like out there, where it's like a 10K or a marathon. It's like you do all this trash talking beforehand, but then it's like, well, then you have 26 miles, like where so much can happen. And so like, I just feel like it's so different. Like in a marathon, like what, you're going to like slap your competitor's bottle away from like the aid station and be like, oh, what bitch? Like, what are you going to do? Like, I just feel like it's like such a different energy. But yeah, like I'll like whenever like when I was watching this and I was watching that scene where like they're on the warm-up track and like they're doing starts next to each other, and you can kind of just like see those dynamics. I could like feel the like the nervous energy and remember what that was like for me in my own experience. Just like, again, you're just all together, and like everyone has this nervous energy, and like it's the Olympic trials, and only like 3 people are going to be happy with the day that they have. And like you've all been training, you know, everything has led up to this moment, and like you're in such a confined space, and you're kind of like not making eye contact with people, but like some people are talking and joking around, other people are just like stone cold, like, you know, you're like, don't look at them. Like, I just, everyone kind of handles it differently. But it's just like the psychological piece is so much a part of athletics, and I think it really is a piece that can separate people out. Because if you don't have that, and you don't have that way to cope with all of that and find the thing that works for you, whatever it is, then like I just feel like there's no way you can make that jump and go out there and do what you need to do and perform under that kind of pressure. And so I thought that was interesting in the second episode, this warm-up scene where it's just like, again, they're contrasting these 2 athletes where like Sha'Carri's like got her headphones on and she's kind of like dancing and like singing some rap lyrics, and it's just kind of like loud and like, I'm here and like, let's go. And then you have Sharika, who's like more quiet and just kind of like keeping to herself and like has the game face on and is just like very much like out of that kind of like spotlight. And that's what you see. Like everyone deals with that differently and everyone has to come up in their own way. But yeah, I mean, the 10 minutes before the event, you're just like, I want to die. Like, I'm like so nervous. Like, it's the worst part. And then you get on the track and then you can kind of like calm down and like refocus. But yeah, those warm up areas are, there's a lot going on. It's tense for sure.
Yeah. I have a few questions for you, like on personal experience wise, like when you're in those different stage gates of like holding and then in that call room, like what are timestamps on that? Like how long usually are you in, you know, like the warm-up area, and then how long are you in the final call room? I know it varies probably, but just like...
Yeah, from what I remember with like track, like I feel like it's like a half hour before the race. Like you're basically just being like moved from one place to another. And there's different levels of like the checking in. So I feel like you always back your warm-up up because you're like, okay, like a half hour out, I'm going to have to start doing these different call rooms. And it's different for every meet. But again, like the Diamond Leagues, like I'm assuming like the World Champs, Olympics, like the trials, like it's a really intense like protocol to make sure everyone has what they need. Everyone's checked in. Everyone has their numbers on. Like there's all these like varying levels of like kind of what you have to go through before like they walk you out onto the track. So I would say it's about like a half hour or so before the race when you kind of start to like go through all of this. And it's probably like 10-ish minutes in like each one, and then they get you on the track. You can do a couple more strides, they line you up, so that's like another like 5 or so altogether it's probably close to like a half hour of doing all of this. And again, for me, when I was in like the height of my track career, like that last half hour before the race was literally the worst part. But it's where you learn how to deal with those nerves. And you learn what you need to do to like keep that calm and to like kind of find like that zen within yourself and not get caught up in like what everyone else is doing. Because I remember like early on in my career, you're paying attention to what everyone else is doing and you're like, should I be doing that? Like, oh my God, just another stride. Like, should I do another stride? Like, she's doing leg swings. Like, should I do leg swings? Like, you're suddenly like questioning how you prepare for a race. It's like you've forgotten and you're like, oh my God, like you're looking at like who you view as like kind of the top contenders. And you're like, well, what are they doing? Like, should I do that? And then you're like, okay, I should just do what I need to do and like not get caught up in that. But when I was younger, just starting my pro career, I was like a mess at some of these races because I'm like, I don't know. It's like you forget what you're doing and you're like, well, I should do what Sha'Carri's doing and I should listen to music really loud and like sing. Well, like that's not at all like who I am and what would work for me. So it's cool that they kind of contrast that because it's so different for everyone, like what that looks like.
You took the next question out of my mouth. I was going to ask like what your routine is and has that changed over time? And it sounds like it's really coming into your own. And I guess to maybe ask a different question related to that is like, obviously if like you were to speak to like younger Laura who's just starting her career, or if you were like mentoring somebody in the sport, do you feel like there are ways to like simulate what that environment is for someone to figure out like what their thing is? Or is it just like reps of like the more you race and the more you're in that environment and understand those personalities, the more you understand yourself and there's no other way to simulate it? Or do you think there's some ways to kind of like hone in on your individual routine?
Yeah, I think you can practice that. I think you have to. I think there's something to be said about like you really get that when you're racing. And so some athletes race a lot more than others because I feel like for them that is where they dial that in, is in kind of those B races leading up to the A race. You want to practice your race routine. You want to go through all of that. So when you get to the big stage, you're really confident in what that looks like. And there's so much comfort and like calmness that comes from executing your routine and knowing exactly what you need to do. I think for me, I can simulate that in training with like time trials. And I treat like a time trial because a time trial is a really hard effort. You're essentially, it's like a race effort. Like I feel like training's hard because you can't always take yourself to the place you have to take yourself into races. And so that can be hard when it comes to like how you prepare for a race and feeling what you're going to feel. So like time trials and training is how I do that. And I execute everything how I would for a race. So if I have like a 5K time trial, like the next day, like I'm eating what I would eat the night before a race. I'm getting up when I would get up like backing out from the race. I'm eating exactly what I would eat. I'm drinking what I would drink. I have all my gels. I have my bottles. You know, you're going to the track. You're doing your same warm-up routine. You're doing all of your drills. Like you can almost practice like the call rooms too about like changing shoes and doing strides and kind of like creating that. You can like replicate that timeline. So I think that can be really helpful because yeah, you want to have that down. And I think, and so for me, like even recently I did like a local 5K here, and it's like, it's a local race. It's not a big deal. You don't have to travel for it, like very low pressure, but it's a great chance for me who hasn't done that much racing this year to really like remember all of the things that I need to do. So when I get to the bigger races, you're like, oh, like I've already dialed this in. Like I'm good. I know what I'm going to feel. I know how to execute it. Because that is, like I said, sometimes racing is almost the easy part. Like I always tell my kids this, once the gun goes off, your mind shuts off and you're just very much in the moment and you're doing what you know you're ready to do. And it's like this sense of calm hits me when the gun goes off. But it's like the 20 minutes before the gun goes off, you're like, why do I do this? Like, this is literally the worst. Like, why did I choose this? Like, that's when like everything is like stressful and nerves and chaos, and you're just trying to keep yourself calm. So it's like, what can you practice in training so that when you get to the race and you have those 20 minutes before where everything's kind of like intense and you're surrounded by your competitors, like how do you keep yourself calm? And you can simulate that. So it's just kind of different though for everyone.
Yeah, that's super helpful to hear. Just like in that, and it is transferable, even though, right, like you were talking about how in the race, distances that you do, the race kind of comes to you, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to talk shit and run 5:20 pace like that. That, you know, it just feels weird.
And like, I'm going to see you for like 2.5 hours probably.
Right,
so
right.
It's just so different.
Like you have enough time to like squash the beef by my
yeah.
But in kind of replicating those environments that you're talking about, like we got footage of the different camps kind of doing these like hard effort days where they're doing block starts like side by side, replicating those like race conditions. And I'm sure like that's where, you know, you're getting locked in and getting the reps in the mind gym, to use a phrase from a friend of ours, of that looks like. Yeah.
Exactly. So that, yeah, because, and again, like when I'm watching this, like I can't imagine the nerves you'd feel like in the blocks. Like, oh, that just feels so different. And then like they hold you for so long. Like you're watching it and you're like, oh my God, like when's the gun gonna go off? And like they're just like up and like you can't even like flinch.
Yeah.
Just a different type of intensity that like, yeah, you would have to practice that like day in and day out, I would think, and just really like dial in that sense of calm when you're in the blocks and like relaxed.
Yeah.
But
I need to do Pilates like just to be in that position for that.
Oh my God, I know. I feel like they showed like, I think it was like Sharika Jackson. It looked like her feet weren't even like touching the track. They were like literally like up in the block. And I was like, what the? Like how
I'm just going to mention how like that went so far under the radar.
Yes.
How positions of the different athletes when they do a slow panicross is like so different. Obviously everyone's doing what they can with their hands, but you're right. Her feet were so high on the block.
At the top of the block, and she was just like, it was like all in her. I was like, how the heck do you like explode out of that when you're just like propped up? You're not even like touching the, like, I had to like rewind it and like rewatch it because I was like, did I see that correctly? And I was like, oh my God, that was wild.
Yeah.
Wow. I didn't know you could, like, there were different ways to do that.
Yeah. It's like one of those things where it's like, it reminds me of the phrase that Noah Lyle's coach used in episode 1, where he's like, you don't teach them how to run best, teach them how to run best better. And it's one of those things where like, to make some other references in the sport, where there are people who are just like naturally fast or naturally gifted at their event. And it might be easier just to like coach them in their own way than to like correct things. I mean, one that comes to mind in like the American distance side is like, I remember watching Karissa Schweitzer run like 10Ks, and just like her form with her arms was like so distinct, and her coach leaned into changing her form. And that was like, I'm sure really hard to learn and unlearn all of that stuff. So maybe starting up high on the blocks is something that Sharika Jackson has always done. And like, all right, well, she's good on the block, so we're not going to touch her.
And you get out. So, I mean, we're not going to like, that's the thing. It's like, how much do you want to change? Like, I get there's ways where it's like you can maximize certain areas and kind of lean into those and really like push that. Yeah. But other things you're like, well, you don't want to like change too much. If it's clearly working, you just want to like refine it. You don't want to completely go in and be like, we got to like start over. So when people are always like, I got to change my entire gate, you're like, well, maybe, but like maybe start with like just figuring out like weaknesses and different like inefficiencies that you can strengthen, and how do you make your like the gate that you naturally have like work the best for you, as opposed to being like, nah, sorry, you got to run like Usain Bolt, otherwise like forget it. And it's like, well, that's ridiculous. Like you can't just overnight like change someone's gate. So I mean, that's how I would approach it. I'm like, I don't know if you have to like drastically change something. You're just trying to figure out how to maximize like what you're already working with.
It's like the mark of a good coach to make that judgment call, and like you see the benefits of it. And I know in the race itself, right, we see she carries a slow start, or kind of the same narrative as Lola, and she outleans Sugar Jackson on her birthday by running 10.76
on her birthday. I know.
And she talks that shit afterwards too. She shades her. She gives her the happy birthday after beating her. Then her coach, Dennis Mitchell, goes up, talks some shit to Paul, like, as they're outside the venue. I'm like, dang, all right. Like,
here we go.
2 to tango from the thing. And they cut to the Paul quote where he was like, oh, Dennis likes to be heard, and it doesn't really say. And I was like, dang.
I know. I was like, here we go.
Now, a question to ask you, right? Because, like, I know obviously there's more to see it. This can't be the only time they see these two characters, right? They
can't build it up the way that they did in this episode and be like, and next, like they have to keep coming back to these, which is why I feel like they're starting with these and really trying to like paint it out, like you said, and show like the stark differences. And then it's like, but like they're setting the narrative for what I assume will be worlds, exactly. Like they're trying to set all of this up for what we know the pinnacle of all of this is a championship.
To me, it's interesting to think about, like, all right, if they're gonna develop these things by maybe in other episodes doing like a side by side of the different races they've done separately, right? Because they said this is the only time we see them race prior. Having those parallel experiences, I'm curious to see, to a point you've made in the first episode commentary, like, how do they introduce new characters who aren't named Shikari or Sherka? Because to this exact point, right? Like, if they're building up to that, when they bring up Dina Asher-Smith and like Marie-José Talu, like all of these other athletes that we like know are going to be in it, are they just going to be accessory characters?
That's how it feels.
Real.
No, it feels like they're going to be accessory characters.
Yeah.
Because you've come out with a bang with these first 2 episodes, where I feel like in a series, that's where you kind of set up for like, this is what you're going to watch. And it kind of creates the characters that like you're going to like relate with or like get behind, or like you understand like, who you're going to cheer for and who you're not. Like that's what the first few episodes are for, in like anything, to kind of like paint that picture. So they've painted a very clear picture with essentially just 4 athletes. So like, I know that other athletes are very much included in this, but you're like, how are they going to like mesh that together, and how are they going to combine some of these narratives? Because right now it just feels very like, this is like, I get some of the commentary I've been seeing where you're like, okay, it's about Shikari and Noah and like everyone else is secondary, and they're kind of painting it out like that. But again, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. But right now I'm unsure. I don't know how they start bringing some of these other big names into the conversation when the first 2 episodes have so clearly been like, this is who it's going to be about.
Yeah. Well, even returning to something you said before of like, I pretty much remember how Worlds went.
Yeah, like I remember how it went. And so I'm like, wait.
Well, forgetting, right? And it's like, it's almost like to create the drama, or like to relive the drama, not create it, because they can't fabricate things like this.
Yeah.
Like, they're going to have to showcase conceivably the times where like Noah and Sha'Carri lose. And maybe it's like they lose handily or they have like a meltdown or whatever. They have to do that in order to not make this like a victory lap of the entire series, because like, I don't know, if I see them beat the pants off of everybody like episode over episode, like we clearly love this sport, you and I, but like by episode 4, I'm like, all right, when do we get to the end here?
Right? Like, yeah, when are we going to see like the big one? Like when, like it's time, like we get it. They're really good. They're dominating everything. They're big personalities. Like let's get to like the world championships. You're like, yeah. So again, I'm like, is that like over the next 2 episodes, are they going to kind of like, they built that up. So then is that when they kind of introduce other athletes to kind of paint more of a well-rounded picture and kind of focus on some of those before coming back to this big one? Because yeah, otherwise you're like, how do you pull 6 episodes out of this? Like, I think we already like know after 2.
Yeah. I will say I'm still, optimistic for the rest of these episodes. Definitely because I want it to do well. But,
yes. Yeah, I think, and like we were talking about this on my other podcast I do with Relay. We were talking about how, yes, something like this is all about getting eyes on the sport, but I think it's also about like retention and like retaining people's interest in the sport. Like, I think that's more of kind of like the ultimate goal with something like this. It's like, yeah, it's great to bring in like new eyes and bring in people that are like, outside of the sport and bringing them into like more of a behind the scenes of what track and field is really all about and how it works. But I think it's more about like building up these storylines and kind of creating some of this like drama and these rivalries and adversaries and things like that to kind of like create and spark this interest of like keeping people entertained with the sport and keeping people like, again, it's like that retention, I think, is what more of this is all about.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But yeah, I mean, obviously as fans of the sport, we're like, I hope this is like, like an Unchained or like a Breakpoint, or is it Breakpoint or Point Break? Because there's I keep getting it confused.
Breakpoint is the certain.
Okay, I keep saying Point Break, and then I'm like, no, that's confusing that they're that close anyway. And then like, Formula One and all of that. It's like, that's what we're hoping this does, but
yeah,
we'll see how it all comes out.
Yeah. As we are wrapping up, do you want to plug your podcast on Relay for people to listen to that too?
Oh yeah, I have 2. I'm podcasting all over the place, you guys. You can hear my voice pretty much anywhere. I co-host a podcast called Relay with 7 other people who are involved in the running industry in all of these different ways. And we do like group chats every Monday and talk about things that are relevant in the sport and what we're seeing in races and all of that. And then I also do one called Lactic Acid, which is more of like, we bring athletes on and do interviews, and it's just me and Dominique Smith. And then this one with Drew. So pick your poison. You can hear me talk about running in like 3 different capacities.
She still has the energy, the appetite some days.
Dude, I love it. So it's so fun for me.
I love it. Well, thank you again, Laura. I know, right? We're coming back. We're going to talk about episode 3.
And you and I aren't done yet. We're doing the whole series.
We're doing every episode. And then, and then who knows, by the time, like, if we put these out weekly, we're going to be running into when the Olympics start. So that's a whole other can of worms.
So much this summer. It's so much, Drew.
You said it last episode. There's so much to consume right now. You have to kind of figure out how and what to do. But sometimes that level of like fandom required is, I mean, I know I ramp up my, like an Olympic year, I'm watching Euros and Wimbledon at the same time. And then I'm like, when those are done, I'm putting on sprint and then I'm back for whatever. So I think we rise to the occasion. So hopefully this somebody listens to this and goes, oh yeah, I'm glad this exists.
Yeah. We know you're out there and you're welcome.
Yeah. All 4 of you. That's what we're here for.
Oh man.
Well, we'll see you again soon, and thanks again, Laura.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Running the Show, a podcast exploring the intersection of running and business. Now, you joined us for this second episode companion for Netflix Sprint, this really highly anticipated series that we've been waiting for so long. We're going to continue putting these episodes out weekly just so you can compare and contrast your viewing experience and your thoughts and your emotions when watching this to analysis and not take this series for granted. I know we're really happy that it's around and we want to pay homage to the effort that was put into creating it. So continue to share your thoughts with us. Please rate, comment, like, subscribe, all the things that you can do. But feel free to engage with us on Instagram. It's probably the best platform for you to share your thoughts, comments, and just insights with us. And we really appreciate it. So we'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in.